Hello, everybody. Good morning. Such a pleasure to be here. I want to greet the organizers of Horizons. I've been a fan. I think this is, believe, my 6th edition or 5th. It's also a pleasure to be in Portland and my new friends that I have made here. I was trying to get informed about Portland and watching that series Portlandia. But as a Brazilian, I miss a lot of cultural references, so I'm more interested in understanding the identity of this place, where you're heading this amazing revolution in the psychedelic field that is going to splash all over the globe. So I just want to cherish the people of Oregon for this amazing historical accomplishment and say that I feel I'm in a kind of futuristic film watching, I can't go like this. What? Psilocybin products? It's just so amazing to see this happening. So many of us have been waiting to see, and people wouldn't imagine that this would be happening before FDA and clinical trials through other channels. So I'm quite pleased to be here. And I was asked to talk by Kevin about why the religious and spiritual model is important and how it differs from the clinical approach. So I want to say that this question, the first point to this question is that I think we need to think of this very premise of this question because it seems to presuppose that the clinical approach happens in some kind of neutral or a cultural space, when in fact, the clinical approach is the non-traditional approach, the weird and unconventional approach to psychedelics. In many ways, the recent one and the one that I feel puzzled to understand and to explain. Traditionally, psychedelics have been used by indigenous people and mestizo communities for millennia, or since time immemorial. And the clinical approach, as we know, is much more recent. And it's a kind of development on these foundations, as we've seen widely in the morning by different presenters. And so my own story is long, but in one line I tried mushrooms in Huautla when I was a recent anthropologist student in 1990 and spent 1 year doing field work and backpacking in Mexico and tried peyote. I did the classic Huautla in mushrooms in Huautla, peyote in Real de 14, and I also tried LSD. 5 years later, tried ayahuasca and went to the Amazon. So it's been almost 30 years that I have geared my entire career to study psychedelics, which comes out of a passion of this beautiful mystery and inspiration and blessing and teachings that we received from what we call sacred plants. And so I have published a lot of books, 25 to be more precise. I just want to point, been kind of hyperactive, inspired to take substances and write about it. It's been a life path for me, a nice lifestyle. This is called Uso Ritual das Plantas de Poder, so the ritual use of power plants doesn't translate so well, teacher plants or plant medicine, sacred plants. There's a debate on how we call them. And this is 14 years ago, and this is last year, so they're kind of, relatives. This is Uso de Plantas Psicoativas nas Américas, the use of psychoactive plants in the Americas. And another one that I forgot to bring, it's Prohibition, Religious Freedom, and Human Rights, regulating the traditional use of drugs. So these books include substances such as ayahuasca, mushrooms, jurema, peyote, cannabis, cat, salvia divinorum, coca, tobacco, toé, snuffs, sananga, cambo, yopo, chimbó, iboga, and beverages such as kashiri. As we know, the use of sacred plants is central to indigenous communities, and in a lot of these places of origin, it's related to the very idea of being human. It's through the consumption of these plants that we became human, and a lot of myths of origin are related to the story of these plants itself. So these plants have played central role in the lives of traditional people, and they can be found in the intersection of diverse areas of life, including politics, medicine, shamanism, aesthetics, knowledge transmission, socialization, and celebration. Again, as I said before, I think it's kind of scary to take psychedelics with doctors in hospitals. No, I respect, I also have a job in MAPS and I support research. I'm just making a joke. I think all avenues are important, but I just want to say that I feel a little funny when I have psychiatrists being so alarmist, about the dangers of this substance. I'm like, it depends on who you talk to and where you come from. The setting is different. So, as we know, some of these psychoactive plants have been progressively incorporated and regulated in developed Western societies by both national legislation and by the United Nations conventions. However, this incorporation of these substances have not gone without challenges, because our definitions of religion are heir to the main world religions, so Judaism, Christianity, Islamism. And of course, there is a huge role of colonization in all of this. These definitions of religion do not match necessarily traditional indigenous or some shamanic conceptions. For example, there is a great irony that you have certain religious uses, such as the Brazilian ayahuasca religions, Santo Daime or União do Vegetal, that have Christian elements, are recognized in the United States, while shamanic or traditional uses of ayahuasca are not. So there's a great paradox in this. Anyway, coming back to the purpose of this panel, why does religion or spirituality matters? In one line, because this is not just about molecules, people. And so the biomedical and scientific approach is based on this model of randomized controlled trials, RCT. This is founded in the idea that we can separate the effects of the drug and setting, and that you can measure objectively the effects of the drug only by comparing it to other groups and the use of placebo. However, this is a very problematic and reductionistic way to understand the psychedelic experience, because the borders between the substance, the drug, setting, are really a construct. They are a fiction. The categories of setting were popularized by Timothy Leary, Metzner, and Alper in the psychedelic experience in 1964. However, these are ambiguous and nebulous categories that are used to define basically everything that is not the substance itself. Go to the little box, setting. Let's put it over there. We all know, and it has been mentioned here extensively again in the morning, that healing is a holistic affair. It includes the individual and also the historical and cultural context. It includes social relationships. It includes the relationships with the human world and with the non-human world, with the world beyond, or the invisible world, the world of the ancestors. Those of us that actually take psychedelics know that there is one fundamental element for healing. It's the friendship and the community that happens around this. How many of you have deep connections? Friendships around psychedelics are so strong and so powerful. They have that complicity, that alliance, that connection, that relationship. In my case, I just want to say, there's also a marriage, because my partner and I like to take psychedelics together, and we met in a psychedelic conference. So I just want to celebrate that. In sum, psychedelics can't be reduced to the narrow world of materialism, scientific and biomedical reductionism, rationalism. And this is what is interesting about the psychedelic renaissance. This is exactly why we have to celebrate. And then I'm going to bring a kind of classic and boring sociologist, just because we have to, as an anthropologist and academic, we kind of have to do those things. I want to evoke Émile Durkheim and say that religion can produce social integration, unite people around beliefs and rights. It produces sociological effects. We know of many communities that use psychedelics and have strong ties, and even diminished levels of violence, of problematic use of alcohol, and people living really measured and balanced lifestyles. And so if on the one hand, psychedelics can help us live better lives, it can also help us rethink our own epistemologies and dream of other futures. It can help us engage in the systemic critique of capitalism, and above all, and this is my queer cry, and I also am dedicating this to my wife, to take down patriarchy. Thank you. Okay, as we said, we're going to do a little bit of a different panel. So the model now, I'm going to ask, sorry, I can't find my notes now, Belinda to come next after me.
Thank you, BIA. Such passion, right? You can tell when you're getting old that you got to use cheaters now. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, BIA, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to speak with you today. Eloqua. I want to first acknowledge my relatives in the original people and their descendants of this land called Portland. I share a common colonial experience with these relatives, and I am an invited guest today. Yat e shikedo shedene sheya Belinda ERIACHO yeneshia haniyani nishle nashteje besheshin the Bethlehem dashache nashteje dashanella. Translated from Navajo to English. Hello, my relatives and friends. My name is Belinda ERIACHO. My maternal clan is the one who walks around. I was born for the Zuni people. My maternal clans are the Black Sheep clan. My paternal grandparents are the Zuni people. This is who I am as a Dene, a Shiwi woman. I come to you this morning to represent the legacy of my great-grandmother, Bishtibat, one who rides with the braves, who was considered a ward of the federal government and was placed into an internment camp in the 1800s. I come from 3 generations of military families who have served their country in the armed forces and have experienced PTSD. I am also the survivor of centuries of intergenerational trauma through relocation, boarding schools, the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors in search of riches and gold in New Mexico, and the ancestors that have experienced it. I am also the ancestor that I have been waiting for. Why do I mention these points? Because it helps to give you the context in what I'm here to talk about, which is the Church of the Eagle and the Condor that I have helped to create with my brothers and sisters in Arizona. The church had its beginnings in 2017 when a traditional Blessing Way ceremony was held to welcome Grandmother Ayahuasca to the Southwest, to the traditions of our people. The Blessing Way ceremony calls upon the Diendene, the holy ones, for positive blessings. In 2018, the Church of the Eagle and Condor was created as a nonprofit public benefit corporation incorporated in the state of Arizona. As a community, we are committed to the practice and the service that cultivates unity, community, and a connection with the Creator. The creation of the church and its continued evolution are the result of ceremonial work and divine guidance. The church is in alignment with the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, the eagle representing the Western mindset and modern technology, the condor representing the earth-based wisdom cultures. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, it is told by many different ways among indigenous people across the Americas. The gist of the prophecy is that when the condor and the eagle can fly together, then humanity will be able to live in peace and in harmony. In the case of our church, the Shipibo people of Peru have begun to share their spiritual traditions of ayahuasca ceremony with us, and I too have traveled to Peru. Convergent with our Native American teachings and principles, we have created a spiritual community across all races, and the value of indigenous spiritual practices, emphasizing the importance of maintaining relationships that honor one's body, mind, soul, spirit, culture, and all of life. This is a time of coming together of people, ancestries, and traditions, along with the restoration of harmony between humankind, Mother Nature, and awakening from the illusion of a separation. The prophecy of the eagle and condor are utilized to form our cosmology understanding of the meaning and the purpose of life, humanity's place in it, the role of spirit, and to cultivate the tools to heal at the most fundamental spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical levels. In that, we are guided by each of the diverse cultures and traditions that we all come from. The foundations of our church are built upon values of reciprocity, which are the sacred teachings rooted in our native cosmologies of the universe and natural law. Right relationship, it is maintaining of our interconnectedness to human and other than human beings. It is also communalism. We have a community bond, and we support one another when needed. We participate in ceremonies, sweat lodges, talking circles, vision quests, rites of passage for our young women and our young men. We practice the value of social equity and justice through sacred activism, a transformative force based on compassion, including a spiritual knowledge, love, and courage. The last value is honor the sacredness of the earth, just as our ancestors have done for millennia. The sacrament of ayahuasca, in my traditional language, I refer to her as Shamasana Azet, grandmother medicine, is a central part of our spiritual practice. On June 9th, 2020, our attorneys for the Church of the Eagle and Condor filed a lawsuit with the federal government against the Drug Enforcement Administration, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the Department of Homeland Security. And due to the status of the Church and Eagle's legal complaint filings, I am not at liberty to discuss the details. But what I can share with you are the elements of this complaint. There are 9 elements to this complaint. Number 1 deals with religious freedom, the Restoration Act. The second one is the First Amendment, free exercise of religion. Number 3 is the Fifth Amendment, procedural due process. Number 4, Fifth Amendment, substantiated due process. Number 5, the Fifth Amendment, equal protection. Number 6, the Ninth Amendment, unenumerated rights. Number 7, Freedom of the Information Act. Number 8, declaratory relief. And number 9, injunctive relief. In closing, I wanted to also share some observations, if I may, and feedback that I wish to share with all of you. As I have listened the last few days to the presentations of research and the legislation that has come out in Oregon, not to state the first obvious point is, where are all of the Native people in the audience? Thank you. I hope that as you move forward with Measure 109, that you include the voices of the 19 tribes of Oregon. This means going beyond the land acknowledgement and reaching out to these communities. It is my hope that it is not just another exercise of colonial shape-shifting, that tribes are used too, and that the status quo remains. Eloqua. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bob. It's an honor to be here, and it's an amazing point in history. hope everyone has a sense that history is being made at this conference and in Oregon. And I have a very strong interest in seeing it unfold in good ways and to avoid hitches insofar as possible, to lift up which is good and most useful. And I want to acknowledge that the process for the people working on Measure 109 cannot have been easy. It's happening, so far as I can tell, in a compressed time frame, with people with all kinds of compartmentalized specializations who are not necessarily deeply aware of the specializations of their colleagues. People probably come at Measure 109 with differing agendas and values and points of view. I'm just guessing from afar, I live in Northern California, that it has the quality of lurching to the left and then a rapid turn to the right. But knock on wood, it's overall moving forward in a good direction. And I just admire the people who are able to stick with the process, listen to each other, bring their expertise to bear, be okay with compromise or provisional measures where those are needed. And, you know, knock on wood, this will roll out in a very beautiful way. I'm going to offer a couple of fairly separate points here having to do with my hope that this will unfold in a good way for the service centers, the facilitators, the public at large, the clients. And one concern that I have is really about how we talk about psilocybin. People in the room would know that it was not an easy task to get various municipalities to pass political measures allowing psilocybin, assuming that the feds don't stop it. And one of the ways to do that is to put up a slide like this. This is from David Nutt's group in the UK, where they did a fairly systematic review of abusable drugs and rank ordered them according to overall harm. Not sure if you can read the fine print at the bottom, but alcohol and heroin have by far the worst harm to users and harm to others within the sphere of the users. Skip down to cocaine, cannabis, GHB, methadone, butane, ecstasy, and the last three are LSD, buprenorphine, mushrooms. So if you look at this, you would say, oh, mushrooms are super duper safe and maligned, misunderstood. Therefore, please vote yes on measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And those measures have done very well. But we need to notice something, which is the harm bar on mushrooms is not flat. It's not zero. And we would do well to understand for ourselves, remind ourselves, and also bring into the public discourse that really nothing is completely safe. Why do I say this? Probably half a dozen times over the course of the session here, I've heard people say in passing, mushrooms are perfectly safe. Our job is to make sure that the mushroom experiences are perfectly safe, which is a noble goal, and it's not always going to be met. There will be outliers. There will be times, despite the best of screening, the best of circumstances, when a high-dose mushroom session leads to temporary, sometimes long-term harm. And I would like for it to be the case that when that comes to light, it is not a shock to anyone that the public who read the billboards and the messaging for the political campaigns don't end up thinking, whoa, we were snookered. Let me give you one example of a mushroom administration, actually synthetic psilocybin administration, that didn't turn out so very well. This took place at a well-known university, above ground, legal, with what I believe to be pretty much the best in class, best available screening, including standardized instruments, cardiac workup, clinical judgment in the course of an interview with a potential volunteer in the study. This volunteer had one psilocybin session that was glorious, filled with insight and illumination and elevation of mood. And then the protocol called for a second one about a month later. The person had an extremely difficult session. Now, people in the room, I believe, understand that a so-called bad trip or a challenging trip is not necessarily a bad one in terms of outcome, and that often people will report that a challenging experience led to huge breakthroughs. This volunteer is not saying that. What they experienced after their second session was the beginning of frequent, unbidden, severe panic attacks. Severe enough that the heart would be racing. After a couple of weeks of that, the person went to their primary care physician, got a referral to a cardiologist, a complete workup. The cardiologist said, your heart is fine, don't know what's going on, but it's not your heart. And the person experienced disrupted sleep. If you know about that, if your sleep is disrupted more than a few times in a week, you become very low functionality at work. And this person was destabilized from their ability to work and have a pleasant life for a period extending months. You might additionally think, well, so we sometimes hear people have a dark night of the soul, it takes a while to recover, but at the end of 6 months or a year, you look back on it and say, boy, that was really tough, but boy, did it land me in a better place. At least at present, this university volunteer is saying, you know, that really just wasn't true for me. If I had a time machine and I could go back and not do that session, I would not do that session. Now, they might change their minds in 6 months or a year, but just know that under the best circumstances we know how to provide, there will be casualties like that all over the map. Might be somebody who at the end of 8 hours is not ready to go home. The facilitator would like to go home to breakfast, the office manager would like to lock up the shop, the volunteer would like to go home, but they don't know where their home is, or they're depersonalized and needing help. What's going to happen? What's the backup? So there'll be a spectrum of things that don't go very well. These will be outliers. I think they'll be very rare. But if you're part of the voting public who got told that psilocybin does great things for everyone, safest drug on the planet, probably safest drug in the galaxy, and then you hear these things, you're going to think, wait a minute, I didn't get the full story. Now, should this be very hard to absorb? Not really. Our culture over the course of a century or more has done a pretty good job of absorbing the fact that driving an automobile is actually very safe, except when it isn't. And when it isn't, we know how to work with that. It's a tragedy, but nobody feels as though, I had no idea there could be car crashes. You can think of lots of examples. Recreational rock climbing. Most everyone knows that if a good instructor, a good climbing buddy, good equipment, the day is good, rock climbing is usually very, very safe, except when it isn't. So the call here is for us all to help the culture understand that the use of entheogenic materials, especially in higher doses, it is dose dependent, I think, it's not always going to be easy. Thank you. The frequency of events that don't go well, adverse events, is thought to be a function of the quality of the screening, facilitator training, skill, and backup. Backup meaning if it's not going well, if it's above my ability to handle the situation, who can I call for the next level of care? And no one really knows what the shape of that is, but it's generally thought that when you have less screening and less training, 20 hours, 120 hours, the cost goes down and the risk goes up. If you move the slider over here and you require more stringent screening, facilitator training, backup, and so on, the cost goes up and the risk goes down. Again, no one knows the shape of these curves. Hello? Yeah, the point here is the risks don't drop to zero. The best university setting, the best screening, the best guides, the risk is not zero. There's one political campaign that decided to deal with this head-on. Decriminalize Denver, I believe, was the first in modern times to put before the voters the idea of decriminalizing, or more properly, deprioritizing the enforcement of drugs against psilocybin. And they thought after a little while, thinking, we should probably present the voting public with a more full picture. We're not just going to talk about the promising preliminary results at Hopkins and NYU and so on. We're just going to be upfront that, like everything else, there are risks. I won't read all this, But psilocybin temporarily raises heart rate and blood pressure. There might be small risk of lasting visual disturbances. In rare cases, the experience can lead to confusion or psychosis that lasts longer than the experience. These effects are usually temporary, but may call for professional care. This was on the homepage. And by the way, this measure won by the skin of its teeth, but it won. It's worth noting that these kinds of adverse events following psilocybin are not limited to drug administration. There's a growing literature about adverse events that follow meditation retreats, 10-day, 30-day, non-drug meditation retreats. There's no time to unpack this chart. Scientific paper, peer-reviewed, 2021. If you look at the bar here, the little bit of pink and the bar over there, these reflect impairment lasting 1 month following a meditation retreat. So the takeaway is when we do strong things with our minds, with our psyches, with our brains, we can expect occasional untoward incidents. Last point here. This panel is ostensibly about spirituality and religion. Show of hands, please. Who would be willing to endorse that they've had powerful, potent, life-changing experiences that they would call religious or spiritual, even if those terms are not well defined? Whole bunch of people. How would you feel if you had that experience in a setting that was advertised this way? Please take a minute and peruse this menu from Sally's Cybin Services.
His time is up.
Yeah, way up.
So I think this is going to be something like inevitable. There will be people who are doing what our culture does, which is to put a price tag on everything, becomes dissected, you pick and choose. And, I don't know, maybe this is a really good thing. It doesn't feel very good to me. I would not be drawn to this. And I would just invite the panel later on to consider this kind of marketing, this kind of pricing, and compare it to use cases that look like this, or like this, or like this, outdoors, or like this. And how do we think money should play a role in all of this? Thank you.
John? Oh, you're so sorry about that.
Here's John.
Some really tough acts to follow here. Such an honor to be here with you today. Thank you, Kevin, and the whole Horizons team for inviting me to speak, and also to the fellow panelists and BIA LABATE specifically for your invitation and support for getting this opportunity. I'm going to pick up on the thread of Bob here on the question of affordability and the Measure 109 program and how it relates to religious practice. In the long-term history of psilocybin in the West, of course, we all know by now, if you didn't before you got here this weekend, that it begins with this story of Maria Sabina. And I like to think as a thought experiment of Measure 109 to kind of ask these two questions as a potential metric to assess the quality of the Measure 109 program and the benchmarks that we need to be aiming for as we embark upon this historic experiment of reintroducing or introducing, depending on your perspective, psychedelic healing into the mainstream society through a government-sanctioned and a government-regulated program. If Maria Sabina were alive today, would Oregon's program allow for her to conduct her own ceremonies here in the state of Oregon? And the second question is, if Maria Sabina were alive today, would Oregon's program allow Maria Sabina to afford her ceremony here in Oregon? As Bob's alluding to, there is this delicate balance between safety and accessibility. And these are one of the predominant tensions within the 109 system. It's not going to be equitable if there's people getting hurt beyond what is to be expected, or the non-delegable risk profile that attends to psilocybin experience. But the policy measure itself emphasizes the affordability of services within the program and says that one of the key purposes of this law is to ensure that it is affordable to all persons 21 years old and older in this state for whom psilocybin may be appropriate. What that means is that it is prioritizing people in this state and not necessarily the tourists who are able to come and afford a multi-$1,000 sessions. Oregon's demographic. Oregon's poverty data is similar to that nationally. We have 13% of our residents live in poverty, and 40% of those live in deep poverty, which is 50% of the poverty line. For those who don't know, what that means is for a family of four, that's $26,000 less, or a monthly income of less than $2,200. The overall picture of Oregon is over 500,000 people in Oregon are currently living at or below the poverty line, and nearly 250,000 are even half of the poverty line. So as we start this commercialized system of mystical experiences, there's multiple reasons why people take psychedelics. We don't mean to presume that it's all this mystical, religious type experience, but for many people, Pew Research data shows that less than half of all people in the United States today self-identify as ever having had a mystical experience in their entire lives. So when you're talking about a system that costs, projections around a minimum of $1,500 to $2,000 for a session, we run the risk of Oregon not only being the first state to create a legal regulated psychedelic services program, but also to become the greatest purveyor of spiritual inequity in the world, where in order to have these experiences that many people appear to be unable to have endogenously, or culturally they haven't been led to seek those experiences, if they're only available to people who have substantial funds to expend on this experience, it's going to just create a systemic inequity that we haven't really, as a culture, really processed what the actual long-term consequences of spiritual elitism or class system. When we talk about the container under 109, this echoing BIA's great comments earlier today, the therapeutic application or the clinical application is, of course, a relatively new container for spiritual exploration. Community has been kind of the container that's long existed, through indigenous populations, and including in also Western populations. We see kind of a number of religions that practice above ground in the United States that openly, despite the legal risks and the legal gray areas that attend to working with psilocybin. So we have that, and the hope here is that we can use community resources as an alternative to the exchange of money and providing a lower cost option of services to get this below $1,500 to $2,000 minimum per session. So the idea of a community-based paradigm of psilocybin services is that it's less of a top-down vertical model and more of a horizontal model where people support people, and that's not centered around this exchange of money. And the best analog I have been able to identify for this is in religious community, where people get together and pool resources, and the exchange that happens in these community spaces is not centered around exchange of money, but it's centered around people supporting each other. Just as I've just been really appreciating the community that has been built here in Horizons over the last decade and a half now. And I think we all understand that in the community container, there is a certain kind of grace that's given and a certain kind of support that's given that yet money can't really approximate when you have that. So with this community-based paradigm, there's a number of policy considerations that support this, and you know, one of the things we've seen in the underground of entheogenic community or psychedelic community is different types of abuse and harms that occur. And if we can invite that type of community-based paradigm for services into the 109 program, we really have a significant opportunity to reduce harm that comes from unscrupulous actors, and providing oversight and accountability into these communities to ensure that they're operating in accordance with best practices, and not having to make these difficult decisions about whether to contact emergency services if there's some kind of abuse that would require law enforcement to be involved, or more commonly, I believe, medical situations in which medical assistance might be beneficial. If people are afraid that they're operating in an illegal or a legal gray area, of course, they're going to be less likely to pursue those kinds of services that could potentially be life-saving. And in fact, we do see in the instance of SoulQuest, a person by the name of Brandon Begley died in an entheogenic ceremony. There's a number of things that went wrong, but I believe that if Brandon Begley would have been operating in a Measure 109 style system, he wouldn't have had to delay, the people providing the services around there wouldn't have delayed calling law enforcement or medical attention, and we'd probably have one more person that we can clearly point to who'd be alive here today. So this is really such an important piece that we not relegate these kinds of practices to remain underground, but that we create a system that allows and optimizes for these kinds of experiences so that they're not only legal, but also affordable to all people. So within the context of the particular regulations that the Oregon Health Authority has promulgated or drafted so far, there are a few key areas where I've identified through our work, through the Entheogenic Practitioners Council of Oregon, that there could be opportunity to optimize this for community use paradigms. And the first of these is that a community is perfectly capable and able to provide its own sacrament to its own community members. One of the barriers to that is this mandatory potency testing of all batches of mushrooms that are going to be, that is at present expected to be required in the 109 program. When a community is providing its own sacrament to its own community members, the community will have some sense of the potency and have an idea for how strong a particular mushroom is. So in order to send it into this commodified, commercialized system where it must undergo routine potency testing for every batch, adds to the cost and doesn't serve a clear government purpose. So just in closing, we're running out of time here, but going back to Maria Sabina, if the answer to either of these two questions is no, if Maria Sabina would not be allowed to operate her ceremonies here, or if she weren't able to afford her ceremonies here, Oregon may well become or perpetuate one of the greatest instances of cultural inequity that we have in society today, where we take a religious sacrament from an indigenous community, put it in the Western world behind paywalls that make it inaccessible and otherwise illegal to access by people who are unable to afford it, including the marginalized people who stewarded these medicines and healing modalities for us here today. Not that they did it for us, but that we benefited from that stewardship. So I just want to thank you all, and I think as Oregonians, it is up to us. We do have the opportunity to build this program in a way that supports equity in the world's first psychedelic services program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all of you. Belinda, I am really cheering for the Church of the Eagle and the Condor and its legal battle. I want to ask everybody to think positive, because this if they win, is going to be such a historical achievement for all of us. And I know you're not in liberty to discuss, so I'm going to ask something different, although I'm really curious about that. What are the 3 concerns or issues that impact Native Americans in the current psychedelic movement?
Well, obviously, I think one of the big ones that has already been mentioned for marginalized communities, access. And one of the big questions for me that I have is how do we go about moving forward when on the reservations, primarily, we have a federally healthcare system, and it usually is not impacted by what happens at a state level. And so how do we begin to move forward and get these medicines to Native American people that really need them? As I indicated earlier when I did my introduction, the intergenerational trauma is very compounded. And you know, recently I went back to the reservation. My community is in Navajo. And it was very evident that we are at a place now in our communities where we're killing each other. And that needs to change. And so I think that's clearly one of the big pieces for me that I think about that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Bob, I didn't know you were working. I didn't know your marketing abilities. I'm going to be asking a question about that. Measure 109 may yield retreat centers offering menu experiences, options, and extra costs add-ons. One of your slides was a nice caricature of this. Okay, facilitators and operators, of course, have to have a decent income. In indigenous cultures, how are the practical living needs, facilitators, shamans, etc., taken care of? How is this handled in a modern, entheogenic, inclusive communities?
I'm counting on you to answer that.
Do you want to go for it?
It's really hard to speak uniformly about this because there's such a wide variety of religious practice, entheogenic religious practice across cultures and even within the communities that practice above ground within the United States. There are, you know, the question is, I mean, fundamentally, as I see it, whether they are professional clergy or whether they're unpaid, and I believe there's both options. I mean, both people do it both ways, and yeah.
Okay, Bob, I'm going to go another one for you then. Given that the risk of adverse events, whether enduring or brief, gross or subtle, cannot be reduced to zero, how can this be communicated in entheogenic communities responsibly, yet without raising undue concern or alarm?
Well, we get to practice that. Imagine somebody hitting the age of 15 and a half in our culture in most states and about to get a learner's permit driver's license. No parent is going to say, driving a car is safe, have at it. And we just understand from looking around us that usually it's very safe until once in a while it isn't safe. It would be helpful when there are untoward incidences following an entheogenic session to not have that be stigmatized and made an object of shame, but to say, oh, somebody had an existential crisis and it took 3 or 4 days of extra care and they're fine now. So just to reveal the complexities of what happens when people have their individual experiences that can go all over the map.
As Hanifa said, we were going to be self-moderating ourselves, so I'm going to be asking myself. Yeah, I'm so divided. Can you talk about Chakruna's work for the Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants? And yes, my pleasure. Sorry, I just feel so suffocating to be an academic, and I wish I was a comedian. Meanwhile,
you are.
Yes, I want to talk about our Indigenous Response Initiative program, and I also want to talk to the philanthropists that are in the room. I am Brazilian, and I moved to the United States 5 years ago, and the inequities between North and South are so grotesque and so big, and there's so much privilege here. And it's just so shocking for me to have done my whole career in Mexico and Brazil, and the lack of funding for everything, and to see these millions of dollars that are being poured into the psychedelic space, and also as a long-time Horizons attendee. This conference feels the more businessy one and more like venture capital one, and less dreadlocks and tie-dyes, and that somebody having some kind of mental break in the audience because they took psychedelics during the conference. That's not necessarily bad, but anyway, I just really want to urge people to, like, what are you doing about it? And what are your ways of giving back? Because everybody can give back, either through scholarships, community programs, discounts, sliding scale. There's ways. So if you only put your energy and your time to think about solutions, I'm sure you're going to find solutions. For us, our Indigenous Response Initiative is a fund of 20 organizations that we invite people to donate to, and we give back to these communities, and we're not determining to them how they have to spend their money. They don't have to make sexy fundraising decks or improve their impact or show their worth or go through numerous exhausting meetings proving that what they do matter. It's on us to support Indigenous people in their own terms, their needs, their autonomy, their sovereignty, and understanding that supporting Indigenous communities is also supporting biodiversity, because areas led by Indigenous communities have higher levels of biodiversity. I'll go back to my colleagues. Belinda, can you talk about what roles of the spirituality have in the field of psychedelic-assisted therapies?
One of the things over the last 2 years, as I've traveled all over the place speaking, one of the things that is very clear to me is that we have lost the science of spirituality and how to navigate through it, especially as it relates to psychedelics. As we all know, everything is energy. And when we get into these altered states, there is also the opportunity to open doorways that we don't know how to close. And therefore, it is very prudent that one understands and works with a practitioner that knows how to navigate in these realms. And so spirituality to me is very critical. In my traditional teachings of the Dene culture, they say that we have 4 bodies. When we come into this physical life, we come in as spirits. And then we go through the evolution of our coming in a form as a baby, our adolescence, adult life, elderhood, and then we turn back to spirit. And the cycles of that as a human being are also similar to what our plants relatives experience as well. And we need to be mindful of that as we do this important work that we are all charged with. And that includes the business aspect of it as well. I'm going a little bit more into this because it's important to bring this up, is that in our indigenous cultures, we look at the life cycle from birth to birth, from cradle to cradle. In Western mindset, we are taught to learn from cradle to grave, and that's it. And what we need to be mindful of in a business context is how do we make sure that we're ensuring that that full cycle is considered as we create these business models. So, thank you.
Bob, you were involved in the Council for Spiritual Practices, and you also have your own private practices that you don't talk much about. I was wondering if you can share anything about how your personal experiences and the Council for Spiritual Practices influence your activism behind the scenes in studies like Johns Hopkins and bringing the element of religion to clinical trials. And You never talk much about that, but we know you know a lot. So can you share?
Yeah, a little bit. That could be a long story. I am entheogenically experienced. I would not have left a nice job in the tech industry a whole bunch of years ago if I'd only read a book, as opposed to actually diving into the pool. And, you know, what can I say? This was before PDFs circulated on the World Wide Web. This was before there was a World Wide Web. Internet, yes. www, no. So information was hard to come by. But I fell in with a group of friends, a very propitious group of friends, psychology graduate student, a Buddhist studies specialist, other people who are really kind of thinking and introspective. And we supported each other over occasional weekend adventures. We would set up simple enough ground rules. By the way, having read no examples of this, about we're not going to leave the premises, somebody will take little or nothing. They're kind of the ground control. Physical contact is okay with consent. Sexual contact is not, even among partners. That's not what this evening is about. You know, and half a dozen other simple ground rules. And over the course of my experimentation with various formations of this group, subgroups, one thing that happened is that I became fairly thoroughly dislodged of scientific materialism. I don't have a good label for what replaced that, but the scientific materialism just went, doesn't fit anymore, which got my attention. So that's the metaphysical worldview realm, as everyone in the room probably knows. Things come up about one's history, relationships, family history, little woundings, little bits of trauma. And when you're with groups where there's a high level of familiarity and trust, those things can be talked about the next day and processed, and not on a timeline, not constrained to a 50-minute meeting, not constrained to meeting for the same 50 minutes next week. It happened in a much more organic way. So I have long been interested in these models that allow people who already have bonds of trust and affection to occasionally get together, construct for themselves circumstances that allow for this holotropism, for lack of a better word, unprogrammed largely holotropism. And you know, who wouldn't want to be with a bunch of friends who've got your back as you're working out what it means to integrate some insight or some inspiration that came under the influence. So, you know, the Council on Spiritual Practices has sponsored studies, mostly at Johns Hopkins, with more structure, because you need to do that in above ground, DEA, FDA, IRB permitted research settings, examining, for example, people without a meditation practice, but interested in developing one. We call them retrospectively novice meditators. How would the introduction of a higher level of instruction or a higher level of interpersonal support, punctuated with psilocybin sessions, advance the paths that they would like to have advanced? So I continue to think about those things.
Awesome. Yeah, at the base of science, there's people that had experiences, and think about it, that bridges this distance between science and the experience and spirituality if you learn about the history of this science. So I love that. Okay, John, back during Measure 109 campaign, Decriminalize Nature Portland came out publicly and opposed the measure. More recently, Decriminalize Nature Colorado came out in the opposition of the passage of Natural Medicine Health Act, the psychedelic policy reform initiative that Coloradans will vote in November. Why are some psychedelic advocates concerned about the creation of legalized, regulated psychedelic programs? Try to keep it short if possible.
Okay, good. I'll keep it in two words or less. Psychedelics industrial complex. I think there's concern that if we, and I want to make it clear, I'm not a part of Decriminalize Nature, and I'm not, and I don't purport to speak on their behalf, but my understanding of the concerns of those movements are that they oppose the creation of legalized systems if they evolve and develop prior to the the decriminalization of plant medicines on the fear that if there are people who start amassing intergenerational type wealth through selling or otherwise working with psychedelics, that there becomes kind of an entrenched financial self-interest that will make the decriminalized reforms increasingly harder to achieve by becoming more lobbying and becoming more entrenched within the governmental system. So the fear is that if we create a moneyed system prior to empowering people with plants, that we might not ever get to the point where we empower people with plants because capitalist interests will stop it from ever happening.
Okay. Sorry. The time is up. I want to say my 2 last cents about all of this. I want to tell folks that Chacruna published today a response to the critiques that have been done by against this measure in Colorado. So I want to invite everybody to join online and read the response from the campaign. And I just want to also talk one final word about Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. And we have been doing work to promote legal harm reduction around the use of sacred plants and issuing public warnings to talk about law enforcement tendencies and monitoring the legal developments involving ayahuasca churches' religious exemptions requests and providing spiritual, emotional, and legal support and resources for folks facing legal encounters with law enforcement. We have also supported the incubation of the Sacred Plant Alliance. SPA is an association of psychedelic churches focused on self-regulation and accountability. And we are also supporting the Church of the Eagle and the Condor in their fundraising efforts and the FOIA requests to the DEA and the Customs Border Protection, including the findings that there were 210 ayahuasca seizures in 2020. And we're creating awareness and platforming Native American voices regarding ayahuasca and peyote regulatory policies and issues around decriminalization, conservation, and cultural appropriation, and providing legal analysis on decriminalization initiatives across the country, and fomenting a discussion on what we call patenting the sacred and the publication of psychedelic commons guidelines. I also want to invite everybody to take a free look at our guide, Chacruna's Guide for Religious Freedom Restoration Act and Best Practices for Psychedelic Plant Medicine Churches. It goes everything about insurance, taxes, preparation, integration, religious rights, how to keep track of your sacrament, how to screen people, how to have a documented doctrine. There's ways that you can self-organize. And I want to conclude by saying, also remembering and cherishing that it was here in Oregon that the Oregon Pharmacy Board had a historical measure. I don't know if people are commenting. I think I'm being intelligent. Maybe everybody knows. But for me, it was nice to remember that the Oregon Pharmacy Board, as early as the 2000s, after considering the petitioning and holding a hearing, ruled that the ingestion of daime, or ayahuasca, as a sacrament was not an abuse of a controlled substance, and that the board, therefore, did not intend to regulate the sacramental use of the tea in Oregon. So let's keep this history alive and continue what has already been happening since early 2000s. Thank you so much. Thank you, Horizons. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Congratulations.